Welcome, everyone. I'm Naseem Ahmadi, Senior Consultant with Earnscliffe Strategies, and I'll be your moderator for today's Civic election webinar. Today, we're discussing the results of Saturday's municipal elections with a focus on Metro Vancouver. The Metro Vancouver region is on the unceded territories of 10 First Nations, including the Squamish, Halkomelem, and Semiahmoo-speaking peoples. But before we get started, I just want to remind all the viewers to submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll fit in as many questions as we can throughout the webinar. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. We have Jonathan Coté, who is finishing his last term as the mayor of the city of New Westminster, where he was first elected as a city councillor in 2005. Jonathan has distinguished himself as a leader in the region as the former chair of the TransLink Mayor's Council and Metro Vancouver's Regional Planning Committee. He's currently a consultant in the local government sector, and we're proud to have him collaborating with us here at Earnscliffe. Anna Lilly is a principal with Earnscliffe Strategies in Vancouver. She specializes in local government affairs and strategic communications. Her background includes consulting, journalism, and communications for the City of Vancouver and other municipalities in Metro Vancouver. Elizabeth Model is CEO of the Downtown Surrey Business Improvement Association, which has provided programs and services for 19 years to support the economic development, safety, cleanliness, and beautification of Surrey's downtown. Previously, Elizabeth was general manager for a land development company, executive director of the Tri-Cities Chamber of Commerce, and owner and operator of tourism and retail businesses.
I couldn't find that on your
Seeley, last but not least, was appointed CEO of YWCA Metro Vancouver in June of this year. She oversees a team delivering supportive and compassionate programs and services, and advocating for systemic change to empower women, gender diverse people, and families. Previously, she served as Senior Vice President of Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at the BC Financial Services Authority. She was CEO of the Real Estate Council of BC, and she held senior leadership roles with the government of BC. Thank you all so much for taking the time to share your expertise and experience with us. And before we get into the panel discussion, let's take a moment to review some of the key highlights of the election results in Metro Vancouver. And for that, I'll hand it over to Anna.
Thank you, Naz, and welcome everybody. I am going to be sharing a presentation. I'm just going to get this set up here. And I always love how you have to transition to slideshow, but here we go. So yeah, we had quite an interesting election result. I'll assume that everybody can see the map that I've shown here, which is a snapshot of Metro Vancouver. Metro Vancouver is going to be the focus of our discussion today, although I will say that the winds of change were blowing across BC, not just in this region, but we're really going to focus in on Metro for the discussion. And as you can see here, we really did have a big shift in leadership, more than I think many people anticipated. These were the results in terms of the mayoral races in Metro Vancouver. And what you can see here is in the red color, these are new mayors. And of course, the incumbents re-elected are in yellow. So essentially what we have is 12 out of the 21 mayors or electoral area representatives in the region have changed, which is a significant shift. It is reminiscent of the nature of the shift that occurred in the 2018 election when a number of mayors had retired and we saw a lot of new folks coming in. So definitely from a regional perspective, we've got some new sheriffs in town in a lot of places. And interestingly, some upsets. Certainly a number of those mayors that are new unseated incumbents, and in some cases as a surprise. There were very tight races, or we're seeing the potential for tight races in big cities like Vancouver and Surrey. Certainly that played out in Surrey. Vancouver was more of a bit of a landslide election, but you can see here just the extent to which there's been some real change occurring across the region. So just in terms of the highlights, in Vancouver, we saw Ken Sim's party, ABC Vancouver, really come in with a very strong mandate. I think he was definitely favored to win, but certainly surprised a lot of people by being able to elect his entire slate. He's got his full slate with him on council. They have control of the Vancouver Park Board as well as the school board. So definitely a big night for ABC Vancouver. And very significantly, Ken Sim becomes the city's first Chinese Canadian mayor. In fact, our only mayor in the city of Vancouver who is a person of color. So I think that he even made that comment on election night in his speech, that's the significance of that was not lost on him. Over in Surrey, we saw Brenda Locke, a previous councillor who was taking on incumbent Doug McCallum. She squeaked out a victory there with her Surrey Connect party. So they have a really slim majority on council of 1 vote. So she has a little bit more work cut out for her to keep all those folks in lockstep, pardon the pun. And over in New Westminster, we saw, I think, some progress made for those who may not be from the labor movement, which has long had not control, but their endorsed candidates for many, many years have been successful in winning the mayoral and council positions. And for the first time, we're seeing that there's a new party, Progressives, that have won 2 seats on council. So the dynamics in New Westminster are going to be different over the next few years. We saw a complete change of leadership in the Langleys, so City of Langley, Township of Langley, both younger, new leaders, in both cases, councillors who became mayor there. And then elsewhere, I would say many of those bigger to mid-sized communities across the region, it's mostly the status quo. So a lot of returning mayors, a lot of returning councillors. So not as much of a shakeup there. So the winds of change did not blow all across the region, but certainly in some of the key communities, we're definitely seeing that shift. From a diversity perspective, I don't think many people would say huge gains were made across the region, notwithstanding Ken Sim's victory. If we look at the members of the Mayor's Council, all the 21 mayors and electoral area representatives, there were 4 women in the last term. Now we're up to 6. So we're making some headway there, but certainly 6 out of 21 is not a significant number. So we'll see over the years if that changes. So just looking at what some of the campaign promises were, what is on the agenda, and I'll focus really in Vancouver and Surrey. Won't spend too much time on this because we're going to get into this a little bit more in the discussion. Ken Sim came out very strongly around public safety, mental health. He has promised to hire 100 more police officers, 100 nurses focusing on mental health. I think there's a lot of discussion now around the mechanics of how that's going to happen. But those were big, bold promises. And certainly members of the media are already needling him on how he's going to make that happen. Certainly housing development, housing affordability was probably, if not the key issue, one of the top issues across the region, certainly in Vancouver. And ABC Vancouver has promised to remove red tape, speed up approvals of housing development, and carry forward on some of the plans that had been in the works from the previous council on development around transit, such as the Broadway plan. I think we'll see them really putting their nose to the grindstone on that issue. They've also talked a lot about efficiencies and finding some spending cuts in the next budget, which will be very interesting. That process is going to begin almost immediately, and they will have some tough decisions to make and a lot of scrutiny on them there. In Surrey, the big promise from Brenda Locke was to reverse the transition to a municipal police force. In the last term, Mayor Doug McCallum had gotten approval from his council and put the wheels in motion to move away from the RCMP and create a Surrey police force. A lot of money, a lot of time has been spent to get that happening. It is midstream. So the big question is whether Brenda can actually follow through on this promise. It has the potential to cost the city a lot of money if it does indeed take the city back to the RCMP or maintain the RCMP. There was a lot of talk in Surrey about transparency and concerns about dysfunction on council, citizen engagement being lacking. So one of Brenda Locke's big promises there is around improving transparency and accountability at council. And there's been some talk about some spending on new infrastructure, such as recreation facilities. So a lot of dollar signs there for Brenda Locke and her team if they want to follow through on their promises. So just looking at the political scene, and where there is control by certain parties, where certain parties are now finding themselves in opposition. This is Vancouver, and of course we see ABC having a very comfortable majority on council. 2 of 3 Green Party councillors got re-elected, and the sole One City Vancouver councillor was also re-elected. So you have among Ken Sim's team 3 incumbent councillors of those 7, and you've got some returning councillors. So I would say about a half the council is incumbent, half new. So there's some interesting dynamics there. Here's Burnaby, where the mayor Mike Hurley ran as an independent. He was, I think, supportive of certain council candidates, but not necessarily the same kind of party system, albeit at the mayoral level. But you can see that the Burnaby Citizens Association continues to have a significant majority there. The Green Party and One Burnaby both winning a seat on council. I mentioned earlier in New Westminster, in previous years, all of those dots would have been orange pretty much, although I won't say that there was always consensus on council. And I'm very mindful I have our colleague Jonathan here, who is just coming out of being mayor. So I don't want to say too much here, but you can see the New West Progressives who made an attempt in the last election to win seats, ran a mayoral candidate this time, who did not succeed, but they did manage to get 2 councillors elected. So it'll be very interesting to see the dynamics in New West now that we do have an official opposition over the next 4 years. And Surrey, as we talked about earlier. So really, you can see that for Surrey Connect, which is Brenda Locke's party, she's the vote that will give them the majority, whereas Surrey First has 2 spots, and Safe Surrey Coalition, which was Doug McCallum's party, has 2 as well. And a number of the councillors involved here have been colleagues in other parties previously, and then sort of split ways. It will be a very interesting time for Brenda Locke as she faces this new dynamic on council and tries to maintain that majority through some of the major votes that she's going to be putting through. So next steps in the region, inauguration of mayors and councillors will be happening the week of November 7th. And a lot of chatter these days about who's going to be taking some of those regional roles. So there are 2 key dates in the calendar where in that regard, the Mayor's Council, which is responsible for regional transportation and is one of the governance bodies of TransLink. That is really all the mayors. There's not typically councillors that sit on the Mayor's Council. So they will decide their chair and vice chair in a meeting occurring on November 17th. And then the following week, we'll see the Metro Vancouver board elect its chair and vice chair on November 25th. So I will pause there, and I hope that overview was helpful, and really looking forward to the discussion that comes. So I'll hand it back to you, Ness.
Thank you, Anna. Yes, very helpful. And I'm going to circle back to you on those regional leadership roles later in the webinar. But first, I want to hear some thoughts from our other panelists, and I'll start with Jonathan. So from Anna's presentation, we could clearly see Metro Vancouver residents We're voting for change in many of our jurisdictions. So in your view, what are the most notable outcomes across the region when it comes to mayoral and council changes? And are there any surprises that really stood out to you?
Yeah, well, thank you, Naz. It was definitely a really interesting election, and I think there were a few surprises that came out. I think the most notable impact of the local election was the change in the two big cities of Vancouver and Surrey. No doubt, Vancouver and Surrey play a big role, being the two largest municipalities representing roughly half the population of the region, but they play a dominant role in regional politics. So a shift in the leadership of both the city of Surrey and Vancouver is going to have a really big impact on Metro Vancouver, and I think that's the most notable impact that we're going to see from these elections. It is interesting that it was an election of change, but there are some medium-sized cities such as Burnaby, Coquitlam, Richmond, Delta that actually didn't see a lot of change. So there is, interestingly, that those medium cities actually saw quite a bit of stability in the region, and it was the kind of the larger cities and the smaller cities where things were a little bit more change was seen in those cases there. But for me, the biggest surprise coming out of the election was actually how poorly the incumbents done. Usually, incumbents have a really strong advantage in elections, and 7 incumbents lost their seats this past Saturday evening. And I think there's probably a number of factors that play into that. And I don't think they were necessarily ideological. If you look into a lot of the races, they weren't really ideological changes. It was really a lot to do with kind of impressions of council. And I would say the councils that had developed a bit of a reputation for not being a bit dysfunctional or having problems were the ones that actually generally saw the biggest changes. I also think operating during the COVID period too, a lot of these mayors were first-term mayors, and during COVID, we weren't out in the community as much and building relationships and getting that name recognition in those community connections that you normally would, being forced onto Zoom meetings for most of the term. And I think that definitely had an impact that negatively impacted on incumbents in the region.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's very insightful. And Elizabeth, what are your main takeaways from the municipal election, and specifically what the results mean for Surrey?
Thank you, Naz. I should just clarify, my last name is pronounced Model, just as a note. So what do these mean for Surrey? Well, as I see it, at this point in time, Surrey's come from a very divisive, divided council to the new mayor-elect, Brenda Locke, who's going to have her work cut out for her. She honestly has to look at going from being more of a politician at this point in time to someone who's collaborative in order to bring her council on board so that things can be accomplished in a reasonable, respectful, dignified manner. And I also know Brenda quite well to say that I think that she would be far more engaging with the community, asking for community's input, and willing to listen to that. So moving forward, I believe that, and I hope that will happen, that that transfer, she'll take a step back and realize that she'll do far more with not only the citizens of Surrey, but her own council, to have them all on board in a respectful, dignified manner. So I think that's probably going to be her biggest challenge. But from a standpoint of other things, we have to look at as how many votes she got, and keeping in mind that 81,778 people didn't vote for her. So how is she going to please her base plus all of the citizens of Surrey? So that's going to be a tricky situation that she gets into, and that's the way I see it at this point in time. That's a personal standpoint. And then from a professional standpoint of meeting those business needs moving forward for the business community in Surrey. As you know, we're so big and we're growing so quickly. And how do you meet all of those business needs with the transportation infrastructure, roads, buildings, sewers, proper staff at City Hall? How are you going to scale that up? There's so many issues that she's going to have to deal with. So I'll stop while I'm ahead and let everyone have a little chat too.
Certainly a growing jurisdiction with diverse needs, so there's a lot ahead. And Erin, what are your perspectives on the results, the biggest challenges you see municipal politicians facing over the next 4 years, and particularly when it comes to social issues?
Thanks, Naz. I think as we've heard, we have a real shift in some communities. As a realistic optimist, this can be an opportunity to build new relationships, to engage with those mayor and councils who will be energized by their wins, and hopefully they'll be willing to dig in on the policy issues that matter right away. We have a lot of them. We have a lot of social issues in our communities, and I think certainly affordable housing and that crisis continues to be at the top of the list. But as I saw in the chat as well, it wasn't necessarily the determining factor. And I think there were other interconnected issues like homelessness, like poverty, like illegal drug supply and substance use, as well as mental health, that also had an undercurrent, particularly I would argue in Surrey and Vancouver, where we did see change. So those aren't issues that you traditionally associate with a local government election. And I think that's the complexity, that it's got to be a collaborative approach to the solutions of those issues, and they're intersecting. So for us as a nonprofit organization serving vulnerable community members, I think we've seen the needs increase, and we've seen that through COVID, and we experienced it collectively as a community during COVID, that visibility of social need. But I don't think we can forget that that need's still there. And that's what I think is playing out when we see some of the issues in the downtown east side, for example. We need to support renters. We need to support people on low and fixed incomes, getting that affordable housing supply in place. We know that we've got in YWCA communities over 800 women and children living in 14 different locations across our different sites, but we have more than triple that on our wait list. So we see that this also creates bottlenecks when it comes to offering transitional supports and transition housing, because what traditionally has been short-term stays, we don't have anywhere to move people for permanent housing. So housing and then those interconnected issues really play out. And I think that speaks to growing inequality. And as we heard, affordability, I mean, having interest rates rise, having inflation as we've had it play out in the last few months, the gas prices, people have seen how that impacts their day-to-day. And we know it's harder for our clients to meet their basic needs. We have many single moms telling us they have to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. And I think that's not acceptable. We know that as a society, and some of that angst has borne out in choosing new leaders and not going with incumbents. And then I think public safety is really the manifestation of those underlying issues. We heard a lot about safety. We heard, I think that came through. We saw it in platforms. I really hope, though, that local governments, whether re-elected or newly elected, that they don't just increase police presence or switch police services as an answer to public safety concerns. Working with different levels of government to invest in upstream supports are really key. And then I think local governments would be well served to look at public safety and other issues through a gendered lens. There are a lot cities can do to support the safety of women, of Indigenous women in particular, and there are even calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls that give a roadmap for that. So lots of complexity, and I think mayors and council members, I have the utmost respect for how hard that role is, but a lot of complex work. And it's time, I think, to go from door knocking on residents to door knocking on other levels of government, as well as the private sector and the nonprofit sector, to engage in how we solution collaboratively.
And I want to pick up on that thread of housing, Anna. We have opinion research recent that shows that affordable housing is the top issue for Metro Vancouver voters going into this election. So in your view, how will the election results public demand for affordability, and the prospect of provincial government intervention in local government land use decisions affect the development of housing in the region?
Yeah, I think housing has been a key issue in the region, sadly, for too long. We've seen affordability really decline, and many councils being aware of the issue, making efforts, some more than others. And then, of course, in this election, really every party that was serious about winning had to have a fairly detailed housing platform and affordability platform. And so we saw, certainly in Vancouver, there were a lot of similarities actually between a number of the parties in terms of the approach that they would take, a recognition that affordability comes with additional supply, as well as some of the demand side policies that we've seen, and maybe continuing those. And there were really only a few parties or politicians in the region who were outliers from that attitude, who were saying, no, we shouldn't just focus on supply. Maybe we need to slow down development. That was not a popular view. I think most of those folks did not succeed in being elected. But you make a good point about the provincial government's role in this. All levels of government have a role in housing, and we saw during the campaign, the Civic campaign, the previous housing minister, who is now running to be the leader of the NDP to replace John Horgan. This is David Eby, MLA in Vancouver, put forward a very detailed housing platform as part of his leadership bid, and it had been fairly well known he was planning to announce some measures where the province would probably come down harder on municipalities to force more housing supply. And his platform certainly put some details to that pledge. So we saw him pledging to, put in some changes via legislation, even to compel municipalities not only to speed up approvals of housing, but to enable different forms of housing, whether that's basement suites, but certainly, multifamily developments, rental housing, and I think doubling down on the commitment of the province to continue investing in social housing. And none of this happens without the cooperation and coordination between municipal governments and the province. Municipalities, of course, are creatures of the province by legislation. So there's definitely an intertwined relationship there already. But I think we've seen in the region and certainly across the province a bit of a diversity of approaches from different municipalities in terms of how much emphasis they've put on enabling supply, and the extent to which they have welcomed provincial funding and opportunities to partner with the province to get housing built. I think most of the successful parties that we've seen and candidates that we've seen elected in the region, I don't know if I would call them pro-housing. I mean, who's anti-housing really? But they're definitely they had some serious platform promises around housing. I would include ABC Vancouver in that. And so all eyes are going to be on the provincial leadership race. I think the money's on David Eby, likely to be the winner of that and become the next premier. And then therefore we would see some of those promises of his play out. And there's a huge conversation to be had in the region and across the province at the municipal level to engage with Eby and his team around what are those changes going to look like. I don't think for a minute that there's widespread acceptance of all of the proposals that he's put forward. I think, Jonathan, you can probably speak to this as well, having been a sitting mayor while this discussion was going on. There's been a diversity of feedback from mayors, some who say, yes, in our community, we've been really emphasizing housing. We've been enabling housing, cutting red tape, et cetera. But my neighbor municipality next door has been doing nothing. So I would like to see the province step in and light a fire under that municipality to do more. Whereas others, I think, quite legitimately are saying, yeah, we want to build more housing, but the proposal that Mr. Eby has put forward really encroaches on municipal authority, really suggests overriding municipal decisions on land use, which I think for many people in the local government sector probably causes some concern. That's potentially a slippery slope. So housing, no doubt, a big issue. I think I saw a comment in the chat from somebody saying, well, actually, everybody's concerned about housing, but it kind of levels out. And therefore, some of the concerns around public order, public disorder, safety, crime, maybe emerged as the key issue in the election. And I wouldn't disagree with that. But at the end of the day, I think housing is going to be at or near the top of the list for every council in this region anyway, in terms of carrying through on some of the promises that were made in the election.
Jonathan, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think that was a pretty thorough discussion on housing, but it is top of mind of residents in Metro Vancouver. It always pulls in the top issue, but it's a complex issue. It's not it's not as if we were dealing with candidates that supported housing versus those that didn't support housing. It's a layered discussion that goes all the way from issues of homelessness and poverty issues, all the way is up to challenges with renters and renters' rights, to the difficulty with home ownership. And all of those issues are complex and related, but they're also different. And voters we're talking about different things in many cases when they talk about housing being their top priority. I think with respect to the results we saw this past weekend, I think generally speaking, the candidates that were successful were ones that engaged in the discussion on housing and were putting forward ideas regarding housing. I would say in 2018, there was a little bit more of an anti-development swing in a few councils, and I think we actually stepped back from that, where there's a lot more what I would say pro-housing, pro-development in some respects across the region. But once again, it is a complex issue, and I think every city will have its own unique nuances there on how it approaches the housing issue. But I think Anna raised a really important issue that I think the provincial government is going to take a much stronger interest in housing issues, and I think there's some good reasons why the province might want to really engage there. But there's always going to be friction when we're talking about local government's jurisdiction versus the province. And to me, I think actually there's really good reasons for both local governments to work really closely and collaboratively to find solutions, as opposed to that being an antagonistic relationship in terms of solving these challenges.
So shifting gears a bit to the needs of the business community, Elizabeth, I'd like to hear your perspectives on what local leaders should focus on to support local economic development.
Yeah, just circling, before I answer that question, just circling back to Jonathan and Anna's comments on affordable housing, which is absolutely key in Surrey, even though we're somewhat more reasonable, shall I say, than Vancouver. I think some of the challenges we face in Surrey, and this is why I think that possibly from a bigger picture standpoint, it has to be a multi-layered government approach. Because the municipalities are voted in by their constituents of the municipalities. And then the NIMBYism comes in. Well, my neighborhood's always looked like this, and I don't want to change, and I don't want, this next door, and I don't want all the vehicles around, and this and that and the other. And so therefore, councils can be swayed with regard to the external pressures that are put on them, and it impacts the housing supply chain and the development community who do want to develop. So that's an interesting take on things too. So that has to be considered as well. So that was just a comment on the housing issue, but completely agree with Anna and Jonathan on that. So the business issues surrounding us, getting back to your original question, Naz, if I remember it correctly, is really for Surrey, is from what I've heard from the Downtown Surrey Business Improvement Association, is a permitting process for the development, because our whole downtown and really so many parts of the town centers in Surrey are changing, and there has been a lot that has been approved, and the permitting process is really, really slow. And I mean, compared to Vancouver, they say we shouldn't complain, But for the developers out here, they are, and that's some of the feedback we've heard is that is the permitting process and the requirements in the new bills and how they're being shifted and changed, even though they put in plans that are correct. And so changing midstream and costing the development community a lot more money. The other thing is a big thing is parking requirements. We see our demographics changing and shifting, and the parking requirements has to be studied and reviewed, because not necessarily are they congruent with some of the people who are coming into the marketplace, who are the millennials, who are Generation X. They might not necessarily have a car. So why have a vehicle for every single parking, for every single condo space in the building? So that's one of the kind of the issues that we're looking at, and Surrey has to look at seriously. Of course, housing affordability, and police issues as well. And it's not just about the policing per se. And I think Ken Sim has really nailed it. It's about the mental health, the wellness. You know, how do you support the police in that, in helping them do their job correctly, and ensure that the people who are mentally ill, who are drug addicted, who are entrenched in the street issues, how can they be handled differently? And I don't think it's just a one level of government. It has to be a three-pronged approach from all levels of government. And the BIAs in British Columbia have actually called for a multi-level, non-partisan approach to this from both the municipal, the provincial, and the federal standpoint, to ensure that some of these disorders that these street entrenched people project and have, which cause the businesses and the residents of such angst in the community, that it's approached properly and in a level where everybody chips in, where everybody recognizes it's an issue. And how do we look at that differently, and how do we approach it differently? It's going to take a very big person to come along to help pull that all together, but it has to be done for our municipalities and our mayors and councillors to succeed long term, and it has to be viable for the citizens as well. This is Canada. We should be doing things differently. So that's some of the things. Property taxes always come into play, and transportation is, and again, as Anna had mentioned, civic amenities. We're growing so exponentially that the civic amenities just aren't here to support, the recreation, the swimming pools, etc., aren't here to support the citizens, and so that has to kind of be made a priority as well. So lots on the plate for them to consider. Back to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think this is a good time to turn to the Q&A and see what the audience members have been asking the panelists.
Sure. Well, I've been keeping an eye on that, and thanks everybody who's been entering questions and comments in the Q&A. And just a reminder, we will welcome any and all comments and questions. If you click on Q&A, you'll see an opportunity there to add something, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to circle back for some additional questions. So I've got a few here. The one I'll start with, somebody has asked, the media has noted a possible shift in demographics in places like Vancouver, where folks are moving to more affordable locations elsewhere in the region. What is the panel's opinion on this? And I'll add, what kind of impact may that have had on the election results that we saw? Jonathan, do you want to address this? I'm also interested in Erin's take on this, because I suspect you and your team keep a close eye on demographics and the cultural makeup of the cities and where people are moving. But Jonathan, as a former mayor in a very urban part of the region, do you agree that dynamic existed and maybe affected some of the voting patterns in the smaller communities?
Yeah, well, I definitely think the changing demographics and moving demographics in Metro Vancouver is changing the political landscape. And it's not new in this local election. If you look at the last provincial election, you're seeing the suburbs vote in different ways that they've never voted in the past there. And I think you're seeing the suburbs, you know, a lot of younger folks are moving out to the suburbs, and even folks moving from Vancouver to the suburbs, and in some respects bringing some of that politics with them there. So you are definitely seeing a bit of a rebalancing in the region. And I think from a suburban politics side of things, it's kind of a younger and somewhat more progressive politics that's coming out to the suburbs, which I think is kind of the interesting transition that's occurring. You know, even you look at the you know, the Langley area, an area you would have thought of ever electing NDP MLAs now has solid NDP MLAs. And you look at the two new mayors in Langley, and their politics are a little different, but they're both younger, a more dynamic leadership there. So something is definitely happening in the suburbs that I think is a direct result in some of the changing demographics and moving demographics within the Metro Vancouver region.
Thanks. Erin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can add to that. I think that the demographic shift, and whether it's by choice or by displacement, I do think people are getting pushed out. It's not always a choice to move, but I think that also creates new dialogue around what is a livable city. And you're getting, with younger voters, not as many driver's licenses and more interest in climate and reducing our carbon footprint. And so I think it'll be very interesting to see how those shifts then play out in the planning and the policy processes around what does it mean to create community amenities and infrastructure that's going to reflect the needs of that younger demographic. So more to come on that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I'll take another question here. Somebody asks, did provincial or even federal politics impact on the results of municipal elections? I'm interested in everyone's take on that. I think, you know, it's probably inevitable that political affiliation always plays a role in municipal elections. I think in some communities more than others. And, you know, remember, we don't have party slates or political parties at the municipal level in every community. In some cases, you'll see just a series of independent candidates running for mayoral or council positions. And there may not really be the kind of dynamic where you have a left-leaning or right-leaning or a center party and identifiable as such. But there, I think since the election night has been a considerable amount of chatter, I think, among the political class about what the results, particularly in Vancouver, mean in terms of, you know, who's got control, who's got the power in the city. Is it the left? Is it the center? Is it the right? And I would say we could spend all afternoon talking about that and dissecting that. Is that really at the forefront for the majority of voters? I don't think so. But it certainly is something to watch, because we have seen, as part of this shift, some of those long-standing political affiliations or persuasions that existed on councils, for instance, in Vancouver, fairly progressive, left-leaning parties who have been in control for many years. Now we see more of a center, or some would say center-right party in ABC Vancouver taking over. And so a lot of questions about whether this means something for the fortunes of the BC NDP in the next provincial election in terms of its results in Vancouver, and similar questions could be asked in Surrey and other places. It's always going to be a part of the conversation. But I don't personally believe that party affiliation or political persuasion really influenced voters in terms of what they were looking at when they went to the ballot box. Jonathan, what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, you know, as I mentioned in my initial comments, I don't think ideology left and right was the dominant feature in the local elections there, although that's always going to be a component of the discussions, though. But it is, you know, a long held view been that local governments actually tend to go in the opposite direction of the provincial government. So when the provincial government shifts right, then local governments shift left, and vice versa. And I wouldn't say that fully explains what's happened there, but I think there is a little bit of truth that when the provincial government moves one way, it gets counterbalanced on the local government level there, and that might explain some of the shifts that we've seen in the local elections.
Elizabeth, any comments on the Surrey dynamics? Surrey is pretty much known as the battleground for BC elections. If you win in Surrey, you win the province. And we've recently seen a by-election in Surrey. So any thoughts there as to the opportunity that any of the provincial or federal parties might see now that they've seen Brenda Locke succeed there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, a great analogy as well. And yeah, I think it's interesting because when I was thinking about the question, when you look back to Mayor Diane Watt's time, she had a Surrey First platform, but it was very balanced because she had some people from the left and some people from the far right and some people who were centered. And she pulled it off for 9 years. She's an excellent job at balancing it all and valued people's input. And so when you look at that and who was elected, and I mean, let's face it, Mayor-elect Brenda Locke has run for the Liberals and before and being an MLA before. So that's one thing, but her team that has been elected is a real mixed bag. So I don't think that Surrey really voted from a standpoint of their party affiliations, because there are, well, let's face it, there's only 3 returning councillors who are incumbents, plus a new mayor, but obviously elected from council. So there's only 4 seasoned players. The rest of them, the other 4, 4 are new. And so it'll be interesting. I don't know what their party affiliations are. So it'll be really interesting. But moving forward with your exact question as the battleground is Surrey, I believe it will be in the next provincial election. And I think the municipal politics will weigh quite well into that as well. I think it's going to dovetail onto that. How that looks at this point in time is probably a little bit early to review. But my personal view is that there will be strong allegiances along those lines. Yeah.
Great. Hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to some more questions from our audience, but back to you, Naz. I think you may have a question for Erin.
I do. So Erin, we've heard concerns through the campaign that members of marginalized and underrepresented communities lack access to the public engagement processes that local governments lead for development projects, neighborhood planning, and other local government policies. Do you see that changing? And in particular, do you feel municipalities could be doing more for Indigenous reconciliation?
I hope it's going to change. I think that you commented, Anna, around the diversity of the elected officials, and I think we have a long way to go there in terms of seeing city council and mayor who visibly represent the populations they're serving. And I think what that does is make it even more incumbent at the staff level that the processes that are used in planning really create opportunities that aren't intimidating, that are welcoming for diverse views. I think that has to be foundational in the planning process so that you can remove those barriers for residents who don't have time to participate in a council meeting. They don't have childcare, or they can't get the transit or the time off work to go. And I think it's not just that ability, it's race and gender and being able to see examples where a diverse planning process gets a better result. So whether it's access to public facilities or well-lit streets, I even heard a recent anecdote about just trying to slow down the walk signal at pedestrian crosswalks for more elderly pedestrians. You know, those are the kinds of things at a very basic level that can help make our cities more livable if the processes used in consultation are more engaging of diverse voices. I think diversity, equity, and inclusion aren't just buzzwords. I think that's where it really has to get embedded, not just for social benefit, but for the economic benefit. when you've got incredible talent coming here through immigration and that opportunity to engage immigrants in our economies, we also need to make sure there's childcare and there's affordable housing and there's community infrastructure to support them, and that we're planning for that future growth. And I think that's what we're seeing in the tension around housing and some of the other pressures around traffic and the challenges of infrastructure to keep up. So as a plug for one of the projects we've launched, it's called City Shift, is a project providing toolkits to city council members and to mayors to help them integrate more disaggregated data collection and to have a public engagement process that really can be welcoming and inclusive. And on your last comment, Naz, I think truth and reconciliation is and will remain one of the most urgent priorities that we all need to share. It's not just the work of Indigenous communities, it's really got to be all of us, government, businesses, nonprofits, working together, and that's partnership and meaningful relationships, but it's also action. I think that I'm excited to see the economic progress that the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh have been making. I think that's fantastic for reconciliation, but there's a long way to go, and there is a roadmap. Again, there's 10 of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action are directed at local governments and cities. And we worked with an organization, a wonderful organization called Women Transforming Cities this election. They did some research that said that more than half of BC cities have made progress on fewer than 3 of those calls to action. So holding our elected officials accountable to those tools that we've been given by Indigenous communities to help with truth and reconciliation, I think that's really key. And to keep our collective finger on that as a pressure point is really important.
Thank you.
I'll say one last thing. I was really sad that none of the Indigenous candidates got elected in Vancouver, but we did see one in the city of Burnaby on the school board. So super excited about having had that breakthrough on the weekend.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Anna, what are your thoughts on the relationship between Metro Vancouver municipalities and senior levels of government? Do you have any predictions on who might take on leadership roles in regional bodies like Metro Vancouver and the TransLink Mayor's Council?
Yeah, well, I will hesitate to throw any names out there. I think that would be dangerous. I'm aware that some of those discussions were occurring well before the election amongst some of the incumbent mayors and councils, and I think the results of the election have shifted the landscape to a degree that maybe some of the leading candidates for the chair or vice chair roles, we may see some changes there in terms of all the deliberations that will be going on. I mentioned earlier that we won't know for some time. About a month from now, both the Mayor's Council and Metro Vancouver Board will be making those decisions. There are 4 primary sort of leadership roles in the region up for grabs. And it's a clean slate at the Mayor's Council because both Mayor Coté, former Mayor Coté, and former Mayor Jack Froese, who were the leaders there, have decided not to run again. And in Metro Vancouver, we've seen a councillor from Burnaby, Sab Dhaliwal, was the chair, and the City of North Vancouver Mayor Linda Buchanan was vice chair. I will predict that likely both of those roles are going to change. So we really have probably 4 roles up for grabs and a lot of discussion going on in the background, some of which I will say is filtering down across party lines in terms of, some discussions about right wing versus left wing and who's going to take control, et cetera. But in my experience, at the end of the day, a lot of those decisions really come back to what are the more important matters around the capability and capacity of those leaders to take on those roles and to succeed. In terms of the relationship between this region and provincial and federal governments, those regional leadership roles are absolutely critical, particularly now, because there's so much on the table for this region in terms of the infrastructure that needs to be built and funded. And the region cannot go it alone. There's billions of dollars of critical infrastructure that Metro Vancouver has in its capital plan. There's a new 10-year plan from TransLink that the Mayor's Council unanimously approved before the election, which also amounts to billions of dollars of new transit projects and expansion of service. The relationship with the province and the feds is going to be key to getting those projects built. And so the selection of those regional leaders, I think, will to some extent come down to how well will they be able to connect with those other levels of government and lead the way to getting those infrastructure dollars into the region.
Now,
Jonathan probably has a perspective on that too.
Yeah, I can certainly shed some light in terms of the leadership roles. You know, as election night, one election ended on Saturday, and almost immediately, I'd say the election for chairs, both at Metro and TransLink, began. I'm not going to speculate in terms of where those roles will end up, but to share some insights, I know when I went for the role of chair of the Mayor's Council, I probably did more phone calls in the weeks ahead than I've ever done in my entire life. And I do a lot of phone calls. So I'm sure there are a lot of phone calls and a lot of discussions taking place between the mayors right now. And although the public won't know for a month, it's entirely possible that those roles could be settled in the next month or so, or they could be settled literally hours before the meetings as well too. So I think we'll have to wait and see how that unfolds there. But just building on one of Anna's comments, just about kind of things getting along party lines. Any recommendation I'll be making to the mayors across the region there is not to firm up along ideological lines or getting a party, recognizing your greatest successes are when you're going to be able to work collaboratively and bring the entire group together, as opposed to having factions at the regional level there. So I'm certainly really hopeful, and I'll certainly be imparting my advice to all of the mayors that they're going to achieve more if they can find a way to work together and work collaboratively across the region.
I'm mindful of the time. We have 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask my last question for quick final thoughts from each panelist on what your advice is for businesses and other organizations looking to engage municipalities in Metro Vancouver in light of the political climate and the issues that local governments are facing. So I'll stick with you, Jonathan, for your last thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I think my feedback would be start building relationships. We have a lot of new elected officials and new mayors around the table, and those relationships are going to be important. But also give some time, because it's quite overwhelming to take on these roles, and there's a lot to learn your role as a mayor and municipality, but also all the responsibilities at the regional government there, and immediately start that relationship. But take some time and let folks get acquainted to their new roles as well too, because you're going to get more effective responses from folks once they have a really good understanding of the task ahead of them.
Thank you. Elizabeth, your advice?
So similar to Jonathan's, I think it's really important, whatever we do in life, is to build those relationships. And it's not just about sending a letter to mayor and council. Well, that's another thought that I had and I want to mention, is that when you send a letter to mayor and council, I've always found the best results are to address them individually. Because many a time, speaking from my experience in Surrey and a couple other municipalities that I've worked in, is if I send a letter to mayor and council, many a time it's been stuck on the mayor's desk. It never gets to the councillors. So I always recommend that you send, if you're doing a letter of congratulations or whatnot, do them individually, to each of them individually addressed, etc. And then seek out those relationships. And the key is remembering those special things that they've done and remembering to follow up with a thank you. And that's an enormous task, undertaking. And let's face it, the pay isn't that great. And they're putting themselves out there all the time and taking literally junk from the community that comes back, and the blowback many times. So just taking the time out to say thank you for running, thank you for putting yourself out there, and that will go a long way in building those relationships as well. That would be my advice.
Those small, thoughtful touches can, like you said, really go a long way.
Absolutely.
Erin, what are your thoughts?
I'd say two things come to mind in relation to the building connections. Make space for the voices you're not hearing. I think that it's intimidating to be engaging even at a local government level. So to be accessible, to create opportunities, use technology or use in-person engagement to really try to incorporate those voices you're not hearing. And the other would be own your power. I think local governments have tremendous power. Zoning and bylaws are just one kind of manifestation of that, but in advocacy with other levels of government to really tell the story of what's happening locally and ensure that that gets amplified, and to be compassionate and empathetic with that power so that our most vulnerable citizens get the supports they need. And I think local governments have a huge role to play in that advocacy. So that's a lot of power and a lot of responsibility, but I'm sure a lot of energy as well with many candidates.
Last words with Anna.
Well, I'll pick up on all of that in terms of what is good government relations, and as you're engaging with city or other levels of government, there's a reason the word relations is in there. You know, relationships are key, but don't forget, we've talked a lot about mayors, but you know, a mayor is only one member of council in our system. Councillors, individuals, can be very influential and are often the champions to get things done. And we have a very extensive and talented bureaucracy in all of the different regional and local governments across Metro Vancouver, many of whom have been in those roles for years, if not decades. And, you know, they're really critical too. So if you have an issue, get some good advisors on your side. That's a little plug. And don't forget to engage at all levels within City Hall to speak your piece and see if you can move the dial on the issues that you care about.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I really want to thank all the participants for your engagement and questions. And thank you so much to it was such a privilege to have all of our panelists here today, Jonathan, Anna, Elizabeth, and Erin. It was a really rich discussion. So that's it from us, and have a wonderful afternoon.